I was always the invisible one, the artsy disappointment they never took seriously. At the will reading, my parents smirked, certain I'd get nothing. But when the lawyer announced I was inheriting all $18.4 million, they literally collapsed. If you've ever been the black sheep, stay with me. This story will make you believe in quiet revenge done right. Lenny Hartley, 29, was not the daughter people expected from a family like hers. In every Hartley family photo, she was the one standing just a little too far from the center. Not by design, but by instinct. Her shoulders turned in slightly, her eyes always drifting toward the edge of the frame. While her parents and siblings seemed carved from the same polished stone, tall, poised, effortless in their elegance, Elena's presence was a whisper in a room full of declarations. She had lived most of her life as a background character in her own family's story. The Hartleys were old Vermont wealth, not the flashy kind, but the kind that came with antique clocks that still chimed on the hour, private boarding schools with mottos in Latin, and family crest cufflinks passed down like sacred talismans. Their name was synonymous with Legacy Hartley, Timber Hartley Investments, and Hartley Hall at the university. They built empires, chaired boards, sponsored galas. From the outside, they were flawless. From the inside, they were suffocating. Elena's father, Charles Hartley III, believed emotions were liabilities best managed behind closed doors, or better yet, buried entirely. Her mother, Evelyn, could dress pain in pearls and pass it off as poise. Their 3 children were each assigned roles early on: Gregory the heir, Victoria the public face, and Elena. Well, Elena had always been the footnote. She remembered once overhearing her mother describe her to a friend as Elena, our artistic one, very sensitive. The pause before sensitive said more than the word itself. It was the kind of pause people used when explaining a minor defect on an otherwise pristine product. At 29, Elena lived in a small, sun-filled apartment above a bakery in Montpellier. She taught art at a local charter school, spending her days surrounded by eager, paint-splattered children who saw beauty in crooked lines and colors that didn't quite match. Her salary was modest, her car had rust along the edges, her clothes were mostly thrifted, though she took pride in mending them with embroidered patches of her own design. To the Hartleys, her life was evidence of her failure. "You were always a dreamer, Lena." Her mother once said the word laced with gentle disdain, "But you can't build a future with dreams." That was the thing. Elena didn't want to build a future in their image. She wanted to build meaning, connection, color. She wanted to teach kids that their value wasn't in perfection, but in perspective. She wanted to live a life that made her heart feel full, even if her bank account didn't. But none of that fit on a family newsletter update. The only person who had ever seemed to truly understand her was her grandfather, Richard "Rick" Hartley. Not the kind of man who wore his wealth loudly, Rick was the quiet backbone of the family fortune. A former Marine turned investor, he had sharp eyes, gentle hands, and an unexpected love for obscure jazz records and oil painting. He was the only one who ever called her Lena. "Art's the only place where broken things can be beautiful," he once told her, watching her paint a weathered barn at age 14. He never questioned her path, never asked her to be more like Gregory or Victoria. Instead, he brought her old sketchbooks from flea markets, introduced her to local artists, and once showed up unannounced to her college thesis exhibition with a bouquet of paintbrushes tied together with twine. When he was around, Elena felt seen, not inspected, not managed, just seen. She remembered sitting with him in his sunroom sipping tea while he thumbed through her latest sketchbook. He was the only family member who didn't try to fix her. He asked questions no one else thought to ask, like, "What colors do you use when you're sad, or do you paint for the world or for yourself?" The answer was always the same: both. It had been a while since they'd spoken at length. His health had declined slowly but steadily, and the family had taken great pains to control his image in public. Behind closed doors, she knew he was tired, not just from illness, but from legacy. From the pressure of having built a kingdom that cared more about walls than windows. She visited him last spring, brought him a sketch of a lighthouse he once took her to see when she was 10. He looked frailer than she remembered, but his mind was still clear. "You're not a disappointment, Lena," he said, as if responding to a thought she hadn't spoken aloud. Her throat caught. "I know you don't think so." He nodded, then leaned in. "They only call it a disappointment when it doesn't match their design. But sometimes, Lena, what the world needs isn't more towers, it's more light." She would carry that moment with her like a candle in a dark hallway. Now, standing alone in her apartment on a gray Thursday afternoon, Elena stared down at her phone. A missed call from her mother. A voicemail. "Elena," the voice was clipped efficient. "Your grandfather passed away this morning. The funeral is Friday. Please wear something appropriate. No warmth, no, 'How are you?'" Not even a pause. She sank into the worn armchair by the window and closed her eyes. The bakery downstairs was already prepping for the morning rush, the smell of rising dough drifting through the floorboards. Her students had just finished a unit on self-portraits. One had drawn herself with a superhero cape made of stars. Elena didn't feel like a superhero. She felt unmoored. But something inside her, something her grandfather had once seen, was shifting. She would go to the funeral. Of course she would. But this time she wouldn't stand at the edge of the frame. She was ready to take her place in the story. There wasn't one wound that broke her. It was the 1,000 little ones that never stopped bleeding. Elena had grown used to the art of being invisible. In the Hartley household, you learned early how to speak without sounding too opinionated, how to smile without revealing too much, and how to exist without disrupting the aesthetic of perfection. Her childhood memories were not marked by explosive fights or violent outbursts. No, the damage came in whispers and glances and silences too heavy for a child to carry. It came in the form of being handed a gift that had obviously been re-gifted, or being seated at the overflow table with the cousins no one really talked to during holiday dinners. She remembered one Christmas in painful clarity. She had spent weeks crafting handmade gifts, painted bookmarks, small watercolor portraits, personalized cards. She was 16, hopeful. When it came time to exchange gifts, her older sister Victoria handed out monogrammed leather journals. Her brother Gregory gave out designer watches. Elena's gifts were met with polite nods and quickly set aside. Later, she overheard her aunt whisper to her mother, "Still stuck in that artsy phase, I see?" Her mother had sighed. "Yes, we don't encourage it, but she's stubborn." Another cut. Her 17th birthday was a quiet one. She had just received news that she had won a partial scholarship to study painting in Florence. It had been a dream she nursed since middle school, sparked by a dog-eared library book about the Uffizi Gallery. The scholarship was competitive, prestigious, and life-changing. She had rushed to the family dinner table, letter in hand, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "They picked me," she'd said, holding the envelope like a trophy. Florence, for the fall semester. Her father didn't look up from his tablet. "That's in Italy, correct?" She nodded, still beaming. Her mother's expression barely shifted. "And how do you plan to explain that on your resume when you apply to real jobs later?" "I wasn't really thinking about that. That's clear," her father had muttered. Later that evening, her mother entered her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and said in her concerned voice, "You're a Hartley Elena, running off to Europe to paint. It's not what we do. It won't reflect well on the family." That was the end of it. The scholarship expired. The dream folded in half, then tucked away in a drawer she never opened again. These weren't singular betrayals, they were a pattern. A slow erosion of the parts of her that had dared to hope for more. It wasn't just that she had been dismissed. It was that they made her feel foolish for ever believing she was worth noticing. And yet through it all, she had never said these things aloud, not even to Olivia, her closest friend since the 3rd grade. Because how do you explain that you were raised with every privilege except the freedom to be yourself? That your wounds don't bleed, they bruise silently under layers of silk and control. Now with the phone still clutched in her hand and her mother's voice echoing in her ears, those memories came rushing back like ghosts, invited to a seance. "Elena, your grandfather passed away this morning. The funeral is Friday. Please wear something appropriate." "No," Are you okay? No, I know how close you were. Just the commandment to dress properly, as if grief, too, required a dress code. She pressed the back of her hand to her forehead, trying to still the dizziness that followed. It wasn't just the loss of her grandfather. It was the reminder delivered so efficiently that even now she was more an accessory than a daughter. She walked into her small kitchen, the morning light spilling across the floor. The kettle clicked off. Absent-mindedly, she poured hot water over a tea bag and watched the color bloom into the cup like ink in water. Her eyes drifted to the corkboard above the sink, cluttered with post-its and kids' drawings. One said, "Ms. Hartley is like a warm blanket that smells like paint." It made her smile every time. Her students saw her. Her friends saw her. Her grandfather had seen her. But the rest of her family, they saw a ghost. Or worse, a stain. Elena sipped her tea and stared out the window. A bird was tugging at a thread from the backyard fence, building something maybe, making a home out of scraps. That's what she'd done too, hadn't she? She had built a life out of what she was allowed to keep, the quiet joys, the friendships that felt like family, the art that no one clapped for, but that she knew had meaning. Still, the thought of stepping back into that house, the house of dismissals, of silence, of conditional love, made her stomach twist. She could already hear her sister's passive-aggressive comments, her father's judgment disguised as concern, her mother's tight smile and tighter hugs. But Rick would have wanted her there. And not just there to be present, to stand tall, not fold in, to speak, not retreat, to show the family that the person they'd spent years overlooking had never actually disappeared. She would go, not for them, for him, for herself. The envelope arrived 3 days after the call. It was thick, cream-colored, and weighted an envelope that made a statement just by sitting on the table. Her name was embossed across the front in navy ink. Not just Ms. E. Hartley or Elena H., like most formal letters. No abbreviations, no sloppily typed labels. Just Elena Margot Hartley. In handwriting that suggested intention. It felt unsettlingly correct. She turned it over her fingers, brushing the wax seal stamped with a crisp W, beneath a line of gold-foiled text. Preston and Weller, LLP. The Hartley family's longtime legal firm. The kind of firm that made things official: birth certificates, business mergers, non-disclosure agreements, and evidently final goodbyes. Inside was a letter printed on thick bond paper. Dear Miss Hartley, you are formally invited to the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Richard Alton Hartley. The event will be held at the Hartley Estate Library on Friday, June 9th at 2:00 p.m. Your presence is considered particularly important to the execution of Mr. Hartley's final wishes. Respectfully, Philip M. Preston, Senior Partner. Her eyes paused on the words particularly important. What did that mean? Knowing her family, probably nothing, just a legal nicety, a requirement to gather all parties regardless of their place in the pecking order. Or maybe it was meant as a kindness, a way of softening the blow that once again she'd be nothing more than an observer in a room full of power. She wasn't naive. Her grandfather had loved her, yes, but love didn't always translate into legacy. Not in the Hartley world. Love was handwritten notes and shared teacups, not asset transfers and boardroom rights. Still, she couldn't shake the strange tug in her chest. The kind you feel when something invisible is pulling you gently, but undeniably forward. That evening, she pulled down a box from the top shelf of her closet, one she hadn't opened in over a year. Inside were several pieces of clothing she'd created over time. Not for sale, not for anyone else. Just for herself. Pieces she'd sewn and painted late at night when the city went quiet. There it was. A simple black mighty dress with soft pleats and a neckline she'd hand-stitched with a thread of dark silver. The hemline featured a pattern of painted wildflowers, blue cornflowers, and soft lavender blooming just above her knees. She remembered painting them while thinking of her grandfather's garden. He used to say wildflowers were rebels. They grow where they're not supposed to, and somehow make the whole place more beautiful. She laid the dress across her bed. It didn't scream for attention. It wasn't designer, but it was hers completely. And she would wear it not despite being a Hartley, but because she was finally done pretending she wasn't. The next morning she received a text from her sister Victoria. "Heard you're coming Friday. Bring something conservative, please." It's not an art show. No greeting, no punctuation, just a reminder of the role she was expected to play. Elena didn't reply. Instead, she carefully folded the dress into her overnight bag slipped in a worn sketchbook and stared at herself in the mirror. Her hair had always had a mind of its own, a cascade of soft waves that refused to hold a tight bun. Her eyes were her grandfather's gray with hints of green in the sunlight. She looked at her reflection and whispered quietly, "You belong." Friday came sooner than expected. She rented a small sedan for the drive to the estate. She could have flown, could have stayed in a hotel, but she wanted the journey. The winding roads through Vermont's wooded hills, the quiet time to breathe and think and rehearse what she wouldn't say. As she drove, she passed familiar landmarks, gas stations that hadn't changed in a decade, a bookstore she and her grandfather used to frequent, the lake where she once painted in the early morning mist, each one a breadcrumb in a trail that led back to a life she'd deliberately walked away from. 3 hours later, she pulled into the long circular drive of Hartley Estate. The mansion loomed before her like a memory built in marble. Georgian pillars, windows like judging eyes, manicured hedges that looked too perfect to be alive. Already parked in the drive were her mother's Mercedes Victoria's black Escalade and Gregory's sleek imported coupe. Their vehicles alone formed a statement: "We are already here. You are late to your own story." She parked her modest rental off to the side away from the line of prestige. As she stepped out, she felt the tension in the air, not just weather, but atmosphere. Like the house itself was bracing for an argument it hadn't yet heard. She straightened her spine, adjusted her scarf, a soft gauze printed with brushstrokes in blue and copper, and walked toward the massive front doors. A servant she didn't recognize opened the door. "Miss Hartley," he said. No question. No hesitation. Inside, murmurs drifted through the grand entryway. Voices she recognized, laughter that didn't invite her in. Her heels clicked softly against the checkered floor as she crossed the threshold. It had begun. Not the reading of the will, but something else entirely. The Hartley Library had always felt more like a museum than a room anyone actually lived in. 2 floors of books that smelled more like status than stories. Heavy velvet drapes diffused the late afternoon sun into a golden hush. Marble busts and polished wood glistened under a chandelier too grand for conversation. It was a room designed to impress, not comfort. Elena stood just inside the arched doorway, taking it in its symmetry, its silence. Then the voices resumed. Victoria was seated on a tufted love seat, her posture as perfect as her blowout. She wore a tailored navy pantsuit and a neutral expression that said, "I was born for this room." Gregory leaned against the fireplace mantel, arms crossed, eyes already scanning the room like he was tracking leverage. Elena's mother, Evelyn, perched in one of the 2 high-backed chairs near the desk, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. Her father, Charles, stood stiffly behind her, looking as though someone had poured him into his custom suit that morning. No one looked at Elena. Not directly, except for Philip Preston. The family's attorney for over 30 years, he stood behind the grand oak desk like an officiant preparing for a wedding or a funeral. His silver hair was combed with surgical precision. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a blade sheathed in velvet. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Richard Alton Hartley." A low murmur of acknowledgement passed through the room. Elena took the straight-backed chair closest to the windows. No one objected, though Victoria gave a quick glance that seemed to weigh whether that seat had symbolic value. It did, but only to Elena. Preston began with the formalities: date of death, confirmation of sound mental capacity, statements of authenticity. The family shifted in their seats like seasoned audience members waiting for the third act reveal. And then came the bequests. To Evelyn Hartley, Preston read, goes the Hartley family jewelry collection, including the 19th century emerald set and the Tiffany heirlooms. To Charles Hartley III, the vintage automobile collection valued at $3.4 million, and the lodge in Aspen. Evelyn smiled faintly. Charles remained stoic, but his knuckles flexed slightly against the desk. To Gregory Hartley, he continued the townhouse in Manhattan and full ownership of Hartley Consulting Group, excluding shares currently held in trust. Gregory smirked. Victoria's lips pressed into a tight line. To Victoria Hartley, the property on Martha's Vineyard and all associated land parcels. Victoria nodded once her features controlled, but her foot began tapping ever so slightly against the floor. To James Hartley, Elena's younger brother who hadn't bothered to show up on time but had just slipped in quietly, $100,000 to be paid out over 10 years through a financial stewardship program managed by the firm. That raised eyebrows. James looked like he'd swallowed his own name. Elena braced herself for silence, for the afterthought. Instead, Preston cleared his throat and said, "Now, as for the remainder of the estate, including the primary residence, the full Hartley investment portfolio, all intellectual properties and controlling interest in Hartley Holdings International." The room tensed. Preston paused. "These have been consolidated under a living entity established 3 years ago known as the Hartley Legacy Trust. The Hartley Legacy Trust," Preston continued, "is currently valued at approximately $18.4 million, including real estate liquid assets, private investments, and intellectual properties." A pause. "And the sole trustee, executor, and beneficiary of that trust is Miss Elena Margot Hartley." The silence that followed cracked the air like ice splintering beneath weight. No one moved. Not at first. Then Evelyn let out a strangled gasp and sank back into her chair, eyes wide, lips trembling. Charles surged forward, slamming his palm onto the desk. "This is absurd. It's a mistake. Some kind of error." Victoria sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, her composure fractured at the edges. Gregory blinked, shook his head once, then laughed short, bitter, stunned. James looked around as if trying to find someone to explain what had just happened. Elena sat very still. She wasn't sure if she was breathing, but Preston wasn't done. He reached beneath the desk and pressed a button on the small remote. Behind him, a concealed panel in the bookshelf opened to reveal a hidden screen. A moment later, it flickered to life. The familiar face of Richard Hartley filled the room, seated in the same library, but looking older, thinner. Yet his voice was as clear and steady as ever. "If you're watching this," he said, "then I've passed on and Philip has just informed you of the terms of my will. I imagine things are tense." A few people actually flinched. "I want you to know," he continued, "that this decision was not made lightly. For the past 10 years, I've been observing not your business acumen, your resumes, or your charm, but your character." His gaze, even through the screen, felt razor sharp. "I set up small tests. You didn't know they were tests. You thought they were inconveniences, favors, or opportunities to look the other way." He paused. "Evelyn, when Dorothy, my assistant of 30 years, needed help with her husband's cancer treatments, you said it would set a precedent and refused to assist. Charles, you fired a warehouse worker with 3 children for being 10 minutes late to a shift during a snowstorm." Evelyn's hand flew to her chest. Charles turned red, then pale. "Victoria, you leaked confidential company information to secure a promotion. Gregory used insider info to manipulate our environmental project's timeline for private gain. James, well, you know what you did." Rick's tone grew softer. "But one of you passed every test. One of you gave money quietly to a janitor's GoFundMe. One of you spent weekends painting with kids in the hospital. One of you never asked for anything but deserved more than anyone. He smiled. Elena. The room exploded. Sometimes the heaviest gifts are the ones wrapped in trust. The chaos hadn't yet settled when Preston approached her. The room still buzzed with gasps, protests, and the soft thudding of disbelief as the Hartley hierarchy unraveled. But Elena heard none of it. All she saw was the envelope. Preston held it gently, reverently, as if it were made of glass. "From your grandfather," he said, voice low, "to be given after the reading." Her fingers trembled as she took it. It was plain no wax seal this time. Just her name written in a slanted, familiar script, Lena. Only he ever called her that. She excused herself quietly, slipping out of the library and down the east hall where the furniture was older, the air less conditioned, and the pressure of legacy didn't press so tightly on the walls. She pushed open the door to the sunroom, her grandfather's favorite place, and sat in the corner armchair, where the light always hit just right. Her hands hovered for a moment. Then she broke the seal. "My dearest Lena, if you're reading this, it means the storm has started. I imagine the winds are loud, but I want you to know you don't have to stay in it, not for me. This gift, this trust, this legacy, I offer it freely, not as a burden, but as a choice. You can walk away. There will be no shame in it, no blame. You've already given me more joy than most people see in a lifetime. But if you choose to stay, then my girl, change it. Change it all. Don't let the Hartley name be just about marble and steel and statements in Forbes. Let it be about people, about compassion, about second chances, about beauty where no one else thought to look for it. They will underestimate you. Let them. They always did. But never underestimate yourself. You have something none of them ever learned to value: soul. And soul, Lena, builds more than fortunes. It builds futures worth living in. I've seen the way you paint the overlooked things, the chipped teacup, the rusting mailbox, the face in the crowd. That's what this family needs. Someone who sees beyond polish. Someone who remembers what matters. I leave this to you. Not because you're my favorite, though God knows you were the only one who made me laugh in my last years. I leave it to you because you are the one I trust to rebuild what we broke. I'm sorry for all the times I didn't say more. I'm sorry for the family that didn't know how to love you properly. And thank you for never asking for more, even when you deserved it. You don't need to become one of them to lead them. You just need to stay who you are. Always yours, Granddad. By the time she finished reading, the paper was spotted with tears. Not the kind that spilled from frustration or rage, but the quieter kind. The kind that came when someone finally saw you in full light. When love wasn't begged for but freely offered. When trust didn't come with conditions. It was the first time in her life that Elena Hartley felt trusted, not for what she might become, but for who she already was. She looked out at the garden, his garden. The wind stirred through the wildflowers. The lavender still bloomed stubborn and soft. Just like her. She could walk away. She knew that. She could go back to her little art classroom and leave the estate and its bitter ghosts behind. No one would stop her. But maybe that's why he chose her. Because he knew she wouldn't run from the mess. She'd clean it, tend it, maybe even repaint the walls with color. She folded the letter with care and placed it back in the envelope. In that moment, the noise from the library, the voices of disbelief and betrayal and clinging power became distant. They would have their say. They would scream, challenge, plot. But she had already been given the final word: trust. And now the question was no longer whether she deserved this. It was what she would do with it. Sometimes the sharpest wounds aren't made by strangers, but by signatures and shared blood. The silence after the will reading lasted only until the doors closed behind Elena. Then the storm broke loose. By Monday morning, her inbox was full of emails from law firms, some from strangers, others forwarded by family members under the guise of clarification. Gregory's was the most direct. We intend to challenge the trust in probate court. This isn't over. Victoria's tone was colder. For someone who always claimed to hate family drama, you've certainly managed to generate a headline. But it was her parents who drew the deepest cuts. Her mother called that night bypassing any pleasantries. Elena? I don't know what story you spun for him, but I'm not going to let you rewrite our family history because you painted a few kids' faces at a fundraiser. Mom. You manipulated an old man who wasn't thinking clearly. That isn't love, Elena. That's exploitation. The words hung heavy, not because they surprised her, but because of how effortlessly they came. Her father's message arrived as a printed letter on Hartley Holdings' letterhead. It read like a corporate memo, Elena. This betrayal is not only personal, but reputational. You've made a mockery of our family name and its legacy. If you have any dignity left, you'll recuse yourself from the trust and allow experienced leadership to resume control. We are preparing legal recourse. Charles Hartley III. She stared at the signature for a long time, wondering if her father had signed it himself or left it to his assistant like he had her birthday cards. By Wednesday, Preston asked her to come in. The law office was quiet and sunlit with deep carpets, and a receptionist who greeted her like she'd always belonged there. Philip Preston met her with a look of calm that bordered on protective. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I've stopped checking my phone," Elena replied. "And I've started drinking herbal tea that tastes like pine needles but claims to reduce anxiety." He smiled gently. "Then you're doing better than most people in your position." They sat across from each other in his book-lined office, a fire quietly crackling behind a screen. Preston folded his hands, then got to the point. "As I anticipated, your family intends to challenge the validity of the trust on grounds of undue influence and lack of capacity. Their attorneys are already drafting motions." She nodded. "Can they succeed?" "Highly unlikely," he said. "Rick. Your grandfather transferred the vast majority of his assets into the trust 3 years ago. At the time, he passed a full cognitive capacity assessment. We have the documentation, video interviews, and notarized statements. The trust is ironclad." Elena exhaled. It didn't ease the ache in her chest, but it did steady her spine. "There's something else," Preston continued, reaching for a black leather folio. "Your grandfather asked me to give this to you privately once legal proceedings had been initiated." He slid it across the desk. She opened it. Inside was a journal. The cover was worn, edges softened by years of handling. Inside, her grandfather's handwriting filled every line in steady, elegant strokes. Names, dates, observations, pages and pages of it. It wasn't just a journal. It was a ledger of character. Gregory. Inflated a contractor invoice to funnel money into a friend's company. Never admitted it, even when presented with evidence. Victoria told a colleague her child's illness made her unreliable for promotion, then took the role herself. Evelyn refused to contribute to employee hardship fund, said it encouraged weakness. Charles dismissed a whistleblower, then bragged about the cover-up to a board member. Some entries were longer than others. All were detailed, dated, documented. It was clear that Rick hadn't made his decision based on a whim or emotion. He had built a case, and he had left it in Elena's hands. At the very end of the journal was a final section labeled Simply Lena. The page was mostly blank. Just one sentence written in soft pencil. "She helps quietly, even when no one is watching, especially then." Elena closed the journal and let it rest in her lap. I don't know what to do with this," she whispered. Preston tilted his head. "You don't have to use it. But if they try to destroy your name to protect theirs, you now have a choice." She looked at him. "So, you're saying, if it becomes a war, I have the ammunition?" "No," he said gently. "You have the truth. Use it only if they leave you no other way." She nodded slowly, fingers still curled around the spine of the journal. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The journal sat on her nightstand like a sleeping beast, powerful, quiet, and waiting to be awakened. She didn't want war, she didn't want to shame them, expose them, ruin them, but she would no longer be their scapegoat. She had spent her life being dismissed. Now for once, she would decide what came next. Some tables were never built for belonging, but sometimes the one who was pushed aside becomes the one who sets the table. Elena hadn't stepped into the Hartley dining room in over 6 years. Not since the last Christmas Eve she attended, where she'd been seated at the end of the table near the kitchen door, flanked by 2 cousins who spent the entire meal texting under the tablecloth. The place cards that year had her name misspelled. No one noticed. Or if they did, no one corrected it. But today, she walked in first. The room looked the same: long mahogany table polished to a sheen, 12 high-backed chairs arranged with architectural precision, fireplace unlit but intimidating, a chandelier that had once been featured in a magazine spread titled Power and Grace. Only now the head of the table bore a single name card: Elena. The rest would sit where she told them to. She had called the meeting 3 days earlier. Preston sent the formal invitations, and Elena had followed up with a single message to each family member. "If we're going to resolve this like family, then let's begin with honesty. You are invited to dinner. Come with open minds. Or don't come at all." They all came. Some driven by curiosity, others by fear. Victoria and Gregory arrived together, faces set like chiseled stone. Evelyn came next, her eyes already calculating. Charles trailed her, his expression unreadable. James wandered in last, phone in hand, hair slightly mussed, clearly not taking any of this seriously. What none of them expected was the scene that awaited them. Preston was seated beside Elena at the head of the table. Flanking him were 2 individuals Elena introduced without flourish. "This is Deborah Lantana, Corporate Ethics Advisor, and this is Dr. Daniel Choi, Trauma Consultant and Legal Witness." At the far corners of the room stood 2 security professionals, silent still and unmistakably present. The family exchanged glances. "This seems theatrical," Victoria said, adjusting her diamond cufflinks. "No," Elena replied softly. "It's protection." "For whom?" Gregory sneered. Elena folded her hands. "For the truth." She opened the leather-bound journal and placed it gently on the table, its weight more psychological than physical. "I didn't call you here to fight. I called you here to read." They bristled, but no one stopped her. She turned to the first tabbed page. On March 9th, 2018, Charles Hartley fired an employee with no severance 3 weeks after the man's wife was diagnosed with ALS. Reasons cited: budget restructuring. Budget reviewed the following quarter showed a $1.3 million surplus. Her father inhaled sharply. She continued. Evelyn Hartley, December 2020. Refused donation to the Staff Emergency Fund, stating, "We already give them a salary. Emotional disasters aren't our business." Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it. Victoria Hartley leaked internal performance reviews to an external candidate for a better compensation package while simultaneously discrediting a colleague on maternity leave. Victoria's perfectly drawn lips parted slightly. "That's a misinterpretation." Gregory Hartley manipulated the release date of environmental audit results in order to mask a failed compliance inspection in Jakarta, resulting in a fine diverted to a shell company he controlled. Gregory shifted in his seat, knuckles whitening against his water glass. James Hartley attempted to embezzle funds from the digital marketing department by inflating influencer contract rates, some of which were paid to fake accounts traced back to him. James gave a small, incredulous laugh. "Wow. You all get ethics violations and I get a TikTok scandal. Classic." The room pulsed with silence. "I didn't write these," Elena said quietly. "He did. Granddad." She tapped the journal. "He watched. He documented. And he gave this to me because he knew you'd challenge everything. He didn't just leave me his assets, he left me his eyes." Gregory scoffed. "So what now? You blackmail us into compliance?" "No," she said. "I give you a choice." She stood, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the journal. You can stop fighting, accept what he left behind, and let me lead the trust. Or you can continue this battle publicly and I'll release the journal as part of the defense. The press will tear it apart, so will the board. But I won't be the one who set the fire. You will. Her mother spoke then, voice surprisingly small. You never wanted this. You said it yourself, you were happy with your paints and your little classroom. Elena met her gaze, soft but unwavering. That was true. But you never understood what art meant to me. She turned to the far wall where a large canvas stood covered. With a nod, one of the aides removed the cloth. Gasps filled the room. The painting showed a family tree, but not one of names and dates. It was abstract textured. The trunk was fractured but resilient, the roots tangled, the branches marked by fingerprints, some smudged, others clear. And at the center, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a pair of hands planting a new sapling. Her hands. He taught me that art wasn't always for galleries or profit, she said. He said it could be a way to heal history, to trace damage and find beauty anyway. This isn't about revenge. It's about repair. No one spoke for a long time. Then Victoria whispered, You painted us. No, Elena said with a soft, tired smile. I painted what we could be. Not every ending is a resolution. Some are new beginnings written in quieter ink. 3 months after the dinner, Elena stood in the renovated wing of what was once the Hartley Guest House, now reborn as the Hartley Center for Creative Healing. The name had taken weeks to settle on. But the mission had been clear from the beginning, to turn the family's legacy of prestige into a place of presence, into something that spoke less of power and more of possibility. The center ran on a non-profit model, weekly classes in visual arts, writing, music, and movement, workshops for trauma survivors, community murals, quiet rooms where grief could be painted and joy could be drawn. Every visitor, from school children to veterans, was treated not as a client, but as a collaborator. And every wall floorboard and paintbrush had been chosen by Elena. It wasn't about redemption. It was about redirection. Legacy, she had learned, wasn't fixed. It could be rewritten not with statements, but with service. To her surprise, one of the first people to volunteer wasn't a stranger. It was James. Her youngest brother, once the aloof, smirking wild card of the family, had shown up at the center unannounced, wearing jeans and carrying 2 trays of takeout. I figured, if I brought food you wouldn't slam the door, he'd said sheepishly. She hadn't. That day they sat on the front steps and shared dumplings while watching kids chase paint-splattered balloons across the lawn. He didn't justify. He didn't blame. He simply said, I'm sorry, Lena. For the things I did. And worse, for the things I never saw you carrying. She didn't cry, but she did lean her head against his shoulder for the first time in years. He started showing up weekly after that, helped organize supplies, ran the center's new podcast, deactivated all his social media accounts without announcement. Feels better, he told her one day. Existing without performing. Vanessa took longer. Her public persona remained intact: power suits, sharp interviews, philanthropy, galas. At first, Elena assumed that would be the end of their story. But one morning, among the stack of envelopes at the center's front desk, she found a small padded mailer. No return address. Inside was an old Polaroid. 2 little girls covered in flour giggling in front of a toy oven. One was missing a front tooth. The other had drawn hearts on her cheeks in red marker. No note, just the image. Elena stood holding it for a long time, the edges soft with age. Sometimes a single photo said what decades of words could not. Her mother stayed silent the longest. No lawsuits, no phone calls, no public interviews, just distance. Until one day a cream envelope arrived. Handwritten. The ink smudged slightly on the name, like someone had hesitated. Inside was a short letter unsigned. I see now that we didn't know how to love what we couldn't control. and we confused silence with strength, elegance with goodness. You were both. Are both. I'm sorry I never made room for the light you carried, even when it was the only thing softening the edges of this family. Elena folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her sketchbook. No reply felt necessary. Some apologies were meant to be read, not answered. That evening, as the center quieted and the last of the volunteers trickled home, Elena walked through the now empty gallery space. The final exhibit of the summer was being installed, a collaborative project by local foster youth. Their art filled the room with bold, imperfect joy. She stopped in front of a small painting tucked in the corner. It was of a tree with cracked bark and wild-reaching branches. In the center, a tiny figure stood with arms open, not strong, not grand, but unshaken. It reminded her of the painting she'd revealed that night at the dinner table. Only now she realized something she hadn't before. That sapling wasn't just about hope. It was about resistance, about choosing to grow where no one planted you, about turning soil soaked with old wounds into ground fertile with new beginnings. She smiled softly and whispered, "We're just getting started." Outside, dusk had turned the sky lavender. A breeze moved through the wildflowers lining the garden path, and for the first time in the Hartley legacy, something bloomed not out of obligation or image, but out of love. Some connections reveal themselves not in words, but in brushstrokes left behind. It was a quiet Wednesday when Preston visited the Hartley Center again. He came without his usual leather briefcase, and for the first time he looked slightly uncertain, like a man who had carried something precious for too long and was finally ready to let it go. "I have something that belongs to you," he said, settling into the sunlit office across from Elena. She offered him tea, which he declined, then watched as he placed a flat-wrapped bundle on the table between them. "Your grandfather asked me to hold on to this until the center was finished. He said you'd know what to do with it." Elena hesitated before peeling back the wrapping. Inside was a thick folder aged at the edges, the paper soft with time. She opened it and gasped. Inside were over 20 watercolors, delicate, precise, and unmistakably emotional. Not architectural studies or landscapes meant to impress, but raw, intimate pieces. A teacup on a windowsill, a wrinkled hand resting on a book, a child's shoes left at the edge of a garden path, each one pulsed with quiet grief and quieter joy. At the bottom of each page was the same small signature in cursive R. A. Hartley. Her breath caught. "These are his." Preston nodded. "Your grandfather painted in secret for years. Never showed anyone. Said it was the only place he didn't feel like a symbol." Elena felt her throat tighten. She ran a fingertip over the texture of one canvas, soft, with layered blues. He was an artist," she whispered. "In more ways than he ever let on," Preston said. "But there's one more." He reached into the folder and pulled out a final canvas, unframed, unfinished. The background was sketched in charcoal. The first layers of watercolor had been applied, but the central figure and open hand reaching toward light was only outlined. "He never got to finish it," Preston said gently. "He said maybe you would." Elena stared at it. The lines were tentative but full of intent. The hand was wrinkled, strong, familiar. She imagined him sitting at his desk late at night, the quiet hum of jazz behind him, painting not for recognition, but for relief. And now he was asking her to finish what he started. That night she brought the canvas home, set it on her easel, lit a single candle, and began. She didn't try to match his exact strokes. He was tighter, more refined. She was looser, more abstract. But as her colors met his lines, something clicked. Her blues met his grays. Her softness balanced his structure. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't supposed to be. It was them side by side, across time, across silence, across everything that had once separated them. 2 weeks later, at the center's autumn showcase, Elena unveiled a special corner installation. 2 frames stood side by side. In the first, Quiet Revolutions, a watercolor by Richard A. Hartley. a study of resilience told through a single half-bloomed flower in winter soil. In the second continuum, the finished collaboration. His outline, her colors, a single hand reaching not up, but outward, toward light. A small placard beneath read, "Art is not always what you leave behind. Sometimes it's what you invite someone else to finish." The Hartley collection. Visitors paused, lingered. Some smiled. Some cried. Elena stood at a distance watching quietly. This wasn't just an exhibition. It was a reunion. Two artists, two voices, one legacy rewritten in watercolor. Some families are inherited. Others are painted into existence stroke by honest stroke. The gallery hummed softly with laughter and low music. The lights were warm, not blinding. Strings of soft bulbs lined the ceiling like stars woven into a canopy casting everything in gold. It wasn't a gala. It wasn't black tie. Elena had made sure of that. It was a celebration. The first annual Hartley Fund exhibition had drawn in over 200 visitors, young artists, supporters, volunteers, curious onlookers, and a few who had quietly slipped away from homes that hadn't known how to love them. Every piece on the wall was made by someone who'd once been told they didn't belong. Now their work took center stage, a sculpture made from broken plates, a mural that read, "I am not my silence." One painting just read, no shapes, no explanation, and no one asked for one. In the center of it all, at the heart of the space, stood the show's keynote piece, a portrait. Rendered in soft oils and layered glazes, it was unmistakably him, Richard Alton Hartley. But not the titan in magazine articles, not the silent patriarch with perfect posture. This was the man she remembered from quiet Sundays. Hair tousled, a spot of blue paint on his cheek, a smudge of green on his shirt, one hand raised mid-gesture still stained with pigment, and a half-smile, as if he were mid-laugh at some shared secret between them. Above the frame hung a simple title, "The Man Who Saw." Visitors paused there the longest. Some asked if he was a famous painter. Others just stared quiet and curious. A small placard beneath read, "He didn't teach me to draw. He taught me to keep looking." E. Hartley. By evening's end, they had raised over $82,000 every dollar to be used for scholarships housing stipends and art supplies for at-risk and displaced young artists. Tyler had organized the music. Vanessa hadn't attended, but had mailed 3 framed photos from their childhood to be auctioned anonymously. Even their mother had sent a small check with a handwritten note for those brave enough to be themselves. Elena stayed long after the guests had gone. She walked through the gallery alone, bare feet padding across the floor, the last of the music fading into memory. She passed the corner where a 12-year-old girl's pastel sketch of a garden had sold for $300. Past the shelf where a young boy's poem about a house without doors had made a woman cry. And finally she stood once more in front of his portrait. "I hope you see it," she said aloud. "All of this." The air didn't answer, but the silence no longer felt empty. She returned to her small office at the back of the center, lit a single desk lamp, and opened her journal. The same one she had started the week after he died. It was nearly full now, pages of questions, sketches, fragments of forgiveness she hadn't known how to say out loud. She turned to the final page, took her pen, and wrote, "I didn't destroy the Hartley legacy. I just gave it its first breath of truth. I didn't tear it down. I opened a window. And this isn't a ruin. It's a beginning. I didn't end my family. I helped it start again." She closed the journal and let out a long, quiet breath. Outside, the night had settled soft and full. Inside, the gallery lights dimmed. And somewhere between memory and future silence and song, a legacy was still being painted.